They called her Grandma behind her back, a quiet joke that rippled through the polished halls of Metropolitan Trauma Center. Dr. Preston Sterling, the new chief of surgery, with a jawline carved from marble and an ego to match, had actually placed a $500 bet in the residents' lounge. The bet was simple. The new trauma nurse, Sarah Miller, wouldn't last the month. He made sure she heard about it. For 3 weeks, Sarah Miller endured it. She was a small woman in her late 40s, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a severe, unfashionable bun that seemed to apologize for taking up space. Her oversized blue scrubs hung on a frame that looked fragile, as if a strong Chicago wind could pick her up and carry her away. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the younger, caffeine-fueled residents to the brink of madness, her bad knee popping audibly with each careful step, a legacy of some forgotten fall. Her hands, when she charted, had a faint, rhythmic tremor. It was barely perceptible, but Sterling saw it, and he used it like a weapon. "Careful there, Grandma," he'd say, his voice booming across the nurses' station, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We wouldn't want those shaky hands dropping a sterile tray. Again." She had never dropped a sterile tray. Sarah would just nod, her gaze fixed on the chart in her hands. "Yes, Dr. Sterling." Her voice was quiet, a little raspy, the voice of a librarian who'd taken a wrong turn and ended up in the controlled chaos of a Level 1 trauma center. It was a voice that was easily ignored, and Sterling made a sport of it. He would assign her the most demeaning tasks, things usually left to first-year nursing students or orderlies. Restocking the saline bags, wiping down the gurneys after a particularly messy code, checking the expiration dates on the suture kits, a task he made her repeat 3 times in a single shift. "Just being thorough," he'd explained with a smirk to a giggling resident, Brittany Moore. "Can't have our patients dying because Grandma forgot how to read a label." Brittany, young and eager to please the handsome surgeon, had laughed along with him. Most of them did. Sterling was the son of a senator, a golden boy from Harvard Medical, who wore a Patek Philippe watch under the cuff of his pristine white coat. His stethoscope wasn't a tool, it was jewelry, draped artfully around his neck. He was the future of the hospital, and no one was willing to risk their career by defending the quiet, slow-moving nurse who seemed destined for failure. Only 2 people didn't join in the mockery. The first was Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse. A woman in her 50s, built like a dock worker, Brenda had survived pandemics, budget cuts, and 3 hospital-wide strikes. She had a 0 patients threshold for incompetence, and at first she'd been as dismissive of Sarah as anyone else. The slow pace, the obsessive rechecking of charts, it grated on her. But Brenda was, above all else, fair, and she noticed things. She noticed that Sarah's charts were immaculate, every detail recorded with painstaking precision. She noticed that Sarah could anticipate a patient's needs minutes before the monitors started to scream. And she noticed that when Sarah spoke, however quietly, she was never, ever wrong. The second was Big Mike Cogan, the head of security. A former college linebacker whose dreams had been shattered by a knee injury. Mike was now a gentle giant in his 60s who knew every employee's name and how they took their coffee. He saw the exhaustion behind Sarah's quiet professionalism and the cruelty in Sterling's polished smile. He made a point to bring her a fresh coffee during the long nights, placing it on her desk without a word, a small act of solidarity in the brightly lit war zone. "He's a piece of work, that one," Mike had mumbled to her one night, nodding towards Sterling's office. Sarah had just offered a small, tired smile. "He's the boss, Mike. Just got to do the job." Her job, for the last 20 years before this, had been different. The tremors in her hands weren't from age or fear. They were the ghost of a 6-hour ordeal in a dusty ditch in Kandahar, her fingers clamped tight around a young ranger's shredded femoral artery, refusing evacuation until the boy was stable, the nerve damage a permanent souvenir. Her bad knee wasn't from a slip on the ice. It was a mosaic of shattered bone and surgical steel, courtesy of a mortar blast that had torn through her field hospital. She didn't move slowly because she was old. She moved slowly because every step was a negotiation with pain, and because she had learned in the Hindu Kush mountains that haste was the enemy of precision. She was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller, retired, Army Medical Corps, a legend in the shadowy world of Joint Special Operations Command, the recipient of a Distinguished Service Cross and a Bronze Star with Valor. They called her Dusty because she was the one you wanted when everything had turned to dust, the calm eye in the hurricane of combat. She had performed surgical cricothyrotomies in the back of a bucking Black Hawk under enemy fire and held a man's heart in her hand to manually pump it while bullets stitched the air around them. Now, she just wanted to be Sarah Miller, RN. She wanted to finish her last few years, protect her pension, and maybe, finally, sleep through the night without the smell of sand and blood filling her senses. She was trying to live a quiet, anonymous life, a promise she'd made to her late husband, whose smiling face in a crisp army uniform sat in a small frame in her locker. But Dr. Preston Sterling was making that promise very hard to keep. The humiliation reached its peak on a cold, miserable Friday night in late October. A torrential downpour lashed against the windows of the ER, and the city of Chicago seemed to be holding its breath. The trauma bay was unusually quiet, the calm before the inevitable storm of weekend violence. Sterling, bored and looking for an audience, strode out to the nurses' station. He held up a small, empty cardboard box. "Miller!" he barked. The entire floor fell silent. "The supply closet on the 3rd floor is a disgrace. I want you to go up there, empty every shelf, and reorganize it, alphabetically." Brenda O'Brien looked up from her computer, her face a thundercloud. "Doctor, that's a job for the day shift orderlies. Miller is one of my senior trauma nurses." Sterling gave Brenda a condescending smile. "And I am the chief of surgery. I believe that makes it my call. I want it done by the end of your shift. And Miller," he added, dropping the box on her desk with a loud thud, "try not to strain yourself. We wouldn't want you to break a hip." The younger nurses stifled their giggles. Brittany Moore looked away, a flicker of something that might have been shame in her eyes before she quickly masked it. Sarah looked at the box, then at Sterling's smug face. For a fleeting moment, the quiet nurse disappeared. Her eyes, usually a soft, tired blue, went cold and hard as chips of ice. Her posture straightened, the slight stoop from her bad knee vanishing. It was a subtle shift, but to anyone trained to see it, it was the equivalent of a predator dropping into a combat crouch. The air crackled with a sudden, dangerous tension. Sterling felt it, though he didn't understand it. He took an involuntary step back. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Sarah Miller slumped back into her tired persona. She picked up the box. "Yes, Doctor," she said, her voice a quiet murmur. She turned and began her slow, deliberate walk toward the elevators, the sound of her knee popping echoing in the silent, cavernous room. Sterling watched her go, a triumphant smirk returning to his face. He had won. He always won. He turned to the others, ready to deliver another witty insult. He never got the chance. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah's story, because what happened next changed everything. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. A high-pitched, frantic klaxon that cut through the sterile hum of the hospital. Code Black. The overhead speakers crackled to life, a dispatcher's voice tight with adrenaline. "Code Black, Trauma 1, multiple GSWs, high-value patient. Military escort inbound. ETA 2 minutes. This is not a drill. The atmosphere in the trauma bay, which had been thick with petty humiliation moments before, shifted instantly. The giggles died. The smirks vanished. Professionalism, cold and absolute, took over. Brenda was on her feet, barking orders. Trauma team to Bay 1. Let's move, people. Blood bank on standby. Get ONEG up here now. X-ray, CT, be ready to roll. Sterling, his face pale, rushed toward the trauma bay, trying to regain his air of command. I'll take point on this, he shouted, a little too loudly. Sarah had stopped at the elevator, the cardboard box still in her hands. She heard the call. High-value patient, military escort. Her blood ran cold. She knew what that meant. It meant one of her own was coming in. She dropped the box. The sound of it hitting the linoleum was a dull, final thud. She turned, her limp more pronounced now as she moved faster than she had in years, heading not away from the chaos, but directly into its heart. The ambulance bay doors burst open with a deafening crash, thrown wide by two grim-faced military policemen in full tactical gear. Rain and wind swirled into the pristine bay. Paramedics scrambled backward out of the ambulance, screaming vitals over the storm. Male, late 30s, multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. GCS of 8. BP is 60 over palp. Pulse is 140 and thready. We've pushed 2 liters of saline and 2 units of ONEG, but we can't stop the bleeding. They wheeled the gurney in, a blur of frantic motion and blood-soaked dressings. On the gurney lay a man built like a mountain, his muscular frame covered in tactical gear that had been cut away. A Navy SEAL commander, a name whispered with reverence in the special operations community. His face was a grey mask of pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sterling lunged forward, all bravado. All right, people, let's get control here. Get him transferred. On my count. 1, 2, 3. They moved the SEAL to the trauma table. The room became a symphony of controlled chaos. Nurses and residents swarmed the patient, cutting away the rest of his clothing, establishing new IV lines, hooking him up to monitors that immediately began to shriek their protest. Sarah stood at the edge of the room, her eyes scanning, assessing. She wasn't looking at the chaos. She was reading the patient. She saw the obvious wounds, the ugly, bubbling wound in his right chest, the mess of his abdomen. But she saw something else, too. Something Sterling, in his rush to play the hero, was missing completely. The patient's neck veins were distended, bulging like thick cords. His trachea, the windpipe in his throat, wasn't centered. It was pushed slightly, almost imperceptibly, to the left. His chest rose and fell asymmetrically, the left side moving more than the right. Tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. Air was pouring into his chest cavity from the gunshot wound, building up pressure, crushing his good lung and his heart. It was a simple diagnosis for a combat medic, one of the first things they drilled into you. It was also 100% fatal if not treated in the next 60 seconds. The abdominal bleeding would kill him in 10 minutes. The collapsed lung would kill him in 1. Dr. Sterling, Sarah said, her voice sharp, cutting through the noise for the first time. He ignored her, focused on a spurting bleed from a piece of shrapnel in the patient's neck. Give me pressure on this. Get me a suture kit. I need to clamp this bleeder. Doctor! Sarah's voice was louder now, harder. Look at his neck. His trachea is deviated. Sterling shot her a look of pure venom. I've got this, nurse. Do your job and hang another unit of blood. He turned to a resident. He's bleeding out from this neck wound. It's the priority. He was wrong. The neck wound was superficial, dramatic but not life-threatening. The real killer was silent, invisible, and suffocating the man from the inside. The patient's oxygen saturation monitor plummeted. 80%, 75, 70. The beeping grew more frantic, a death knell counting down the seconds. The SEAL's lips were turning a dusky violet. His eyes rolled back in his head. "He's crashing!" a resident yelled. "We're losing him!" Sterling froze. For all his arrogance, for all his textbook knowledge from Harvard, he was a surgeon, not a trauma specialist. He was used to scheduled procedures in a sterile operating room, not the violent, explosive reality of a man dying in front of him. He stared at the monitors, his face a mask of panic. He had focused on the wrong injury. He had missed the obvious. And now his patient was dying. Sarah Miller saw his hesitation. She saw the fear in his eyes, and in that moment, she made a choice. Her career versus this man's life. Her quiet, anonymous retirement versus her oath. It wasn't a choice at all. She moved. She didn't run like the younger nurses, all flailing limbs and wasted energy. She moved with the terrifying, fluid precision of an apex predator. One moment she was at the edge of the room, the next she was beside the table. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't check the chart. "Get out of the way," she commanded, and her voice was no longer the quiet rasp of a librarian. It was the iron-clad bellow of a lieutenant colonel who had commanded medevac teams in the middle of a firefight. It was a voice that expected and received immediate obedience. Sterling, startled, turned to confront her. "What did you just say to me?" "You are finished." Sarah didn't argue. She didn't waste time with words. She dipped her shoulder and checked him with a rigid elbow to the chest. It wasn't a push, it was a tactical block, a move designed to create space with maximum efficiency. Sterling, caught off balance, stumbled backward, crashing into a supply cart with a clatter of metal instruments. The room went deathly silent. Every eye was on the quiet, graying nurse who had just assaulted the chief of surgery. Sarah ignored them all. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the dying man on the table. She placed her left hand on his chest, her fingers moving with unerring certainty, feeling for the space between his second and third ribs, mid-clavicular line. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the dust and darkness, guided by feel alone. 14-gauge needle, she snapped, not looking up. A resident, wide-eyed and trembling, slapped it into her open palm without thinking. She didn't swab the area with alcohol. There was no time. She plunged the long needle deep into the man's chest, through skin and muscle, until she felt the distinct pop as it entered the pleural space. Hiss. The sound was audible throughout the entire silent room. It was the sound of trapped air, of a week's worth of pressure escaping in a single, life-giving rush. The effect was instantaneous. The patient's chest rose, a beautiful symmetrical rise and fall. The oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor, which had dipped into the low 60s, began to climb. 70, 80, 92, 98. The violet tinge of his lips faded to a healthy pink. His heart rate, which had been dangerously high, settled into a steady, strong rhythm. He took a deep, shuddering gasp of air. Sarah held the catheter in place for a moment, then secured it with a strip of tape. She peeled off her bloody gloves and stepped back from the table, her hands finally beginning to shake, the adrenaline dump hitting her now that the danger had passed. She looked at Dr. Preston Sterling, who was picking himself up off the floor, his face a mottled canvas of fury and utter humiliation. "He's stable," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "For now. Do your job, doctor. Take him to surgery and fix the holes in his abdomen." The trauma team, shaken from their stupor, snapped back into action, a new and profound respect in their eyes. They began prepping the patient for transport to the operating room. But as they moved him, the Navy SEAL commander's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with pain and drugs, but they were lucid. His gaze swept past the doctors, past the nurses, past the chaos. He was looking for someone. His eyes found Sarah. He recognized her, not her face, but her presence. The calm authority, the impossible competence. He had heard the stories, the legends whispered around campfires in Afghanistan and Iraq. The ghost medic who always appeared when things were at their worst. His hand, shaking with effort, rose from the gurney. He didn't try to speak. He simply lifted his hand to his brow, a slow, formal, lingering salute of absolute respect. A salute from a warrior to a warrior. Then, through the oxygen mask, he rasped a single word, a name no one in that room could possibly have known. Dusty. The two military policemen standing guard at the door, who had watched the entire scene unfold, snapped to rigid attention. Their faces were carved from stone. Sterling stared, his mouth agape. What? What the hell just happened? No one answered him. They were all staring at Sarah Miller, the quiet, slow, incompetent old nurse, as if she had just grown a second head. Brenda O'Brien's jaw was on the floor. Brittany Moore's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding of who she had been mocking for the last 3 weeks. Sarah just gave the SEAL a small, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, Commander," she murmured. "Let us work." Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling. Because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. The aftermath was swift and brutal. As soon as the SEAL was wheeled out towards the operating room, Dr. Preston Sterling's humiliation curdled into white-hot rage. The veneer of the polished, charming surgeon shattered, revealing the petty, terrified man beneath. "Security!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get security in here, now!" Big Mike Cogan was already there, having watched the entire scene from the doorway, his face a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. "You saw that!" Sterling screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "She assaulted me! She performed an unauthorized procedure on a patient. She's a menace! She's unstable!" Sarah stood quietly by the supply cart, leaning against it as if her legs could no longer support her. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. She knew what was coming. She had known it the moment she decided to intervene. "Dr. Sterling," Brenda started, stepping forward. "She saved his life. You froze. We all saw it." "You stay out of this, O'Brien," Sterling spat, "or you'll be next. I want her badge. I want her license. I want her out of my hospital. Now." 20 minutes later, Sarah was sitting in a plush leather chair in a cold, sterile administrative conference room. Across the polished mahogany table sat Harold Pemberton, the hospital administrator, a man who sweated profusely even in a climate-controlled room. Beside him, looking smug and vindicated, was Dr. Sterling, now in a clean suit, a faint purple bruise blooming on his chest where Sarah's elbow had connected. An equally cold woman from Human Resources sat with a file open, refusing to make eye contact. "Sarah Miller," Pemberton began, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "We have a very serious situation here. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint. He alleges gross misconduct, insubordination, and physical assault. He also states," the HR director added in a monotone, reading from the file, "that your unauthorized and reckless intervention may have caused further complications, which he then had to heroically manage." Sarah looked at her hands, which were resting in her lap. The tremor was back, more pronounced now. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That is not the point," Sterling snapped. "The point is protocol, chain of command. You can't just have nurses running around stabbing patients in the chest whenever they feel like it. It's anarchy." Pemberton wrung his hands. The hospital has a liability to consider, Sarah. We cannot have staff members physically accosting a department head. It sets a terrible precedent. He was looking at Sterling's senator father, not at the nurse in front of him. He was calculating the political and financial fallout. A decorated SEAL commander nearly dying was bad. A senator's son claiming assault was worse. "I did my job," Sarah said, looking up for the first time, her gaze meeting Pemberton's. "I honored my oath." "Your job is to follow the orders of the attending physician," Sterling sneered, "and you failed." Pemberton cleared his throat. "Effective immediately. Your employment at Metropolitan Trauma Center is terminated. We'll have security escort you to your locker to collect your personal belongings." He slid a pre-printed termination letter across the table. He hadn't even waited for her side of the story. Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at Sterling's triumphant face. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She stood up, her bad knee protesting with a loud pop. "Fine," she said, with a quiet dignity that infuriated Sterling more than any outburst could have. "If saving a life costs my career, I'll pay that price." She turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at Sterling. "When you write up your report, will you tell them you saved him?" With that, she walked out. Big Mike was waiting for her in the hallway. His face was a mask of sorrow and anger. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, his voice thick. "This isn't right." "It's okay, Mike," she said, managing a small smile. "Watch that blood pressure, you hear?" He walked with her to the locker room. Other nurses and staff members saw them, saw the grim look on Mike's face, and quickly averted their eyes. They knew what was happening. They knew it was unjust. But they also knew they could be next if they spoke up. The silence was a testament to the culture of fear Sterling had cultivated. Sarah opened her locker and began to pack her life into a small brown cardboard box. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Nurse," a worn pair of trauma shears she'd had since her army days, the stethoscope she had bought with her first paycheck as a civilian, a dying succulent plant someone had given her, and finally the small framed photo of her husband, his young face beaming with pride in his dress uniform. 2 decades of saving lives, of blood and sweat and tears, reduced to a box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. Mike escorted her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing the dark, rain-swept Chicago street. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," Mike said, his voice heavy. She stepped out into the pouring rain. The doors slid shut behind her, sealing her off from the world she had dedicated her life to. It was over. The thought wasn't angry or sad. It was just a heavy, suffocating fact. Her car was in the shop, a repair she couldn't afford. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. She clutched the soggy cardboard box to her chest, trying to shield her husband's photo from the deluge. The cold rain plastered her hair to her forehead and soaked through her thin scrubs. Each step sent a jolt of fire through her bad knee, a throbbing rhythm that matched the relentless beat of the rain on the pavement. She huddled under the flimsy shelter of a bus stop, shivering. The weight of the box seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Her chest felt tight, her throat burning. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just an old, stubborn nurse who didn't know her place. He would press charges. There would be a police report. She'd lose her nursing certification. She'd end up greeting customers at a grocery store. Another forgotten old woman with a story no one would ever believe. A bus pulled up with a hiss of air brakes, its headlights cutting through the gloom. As she looked at her reflection in the rain-streaked window, she saw just what Sterling and the others saw, a tired, defeated old woman. And then, above the rumble of the bus and the drumming of the rain, she heard it. A low thrumming. Thwop, thwop, thwop. It started as a vibration in the soles of her feet, a tremor in the puddles on the street, It grew rapidly, a sound that didn't belong in the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago. It was a sound she knew in her bones, a sound that had been the soundtrack to both her greatest triumphs and her worst nightmares. The sound of helicopter rotors. The bus driver stared, his mouth open. Pedestrians on the street stopped, umbrellas forgotten, and looked up into the dark, weeping sky. The thrumming grew into a deafening roar that pressed against her chest, rattling the glass of the bus shelter. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, sleek and black as midnight, tore through the low-hanging clouds. They weren't heading for the hospital's rooftop helipad. They were descending, impossibly, toward the street right in front of her. Down the block, tires screeched. Black SUVs, the kind with government plates, materialized out of the rain, blocking the intersection with tactical precision. Men in dark suits and military police uniforms spilled out, securing the perimeter, their movements sharp and economical. The entire street was locked down in seconds. Red and blue lights from a dozen unseen vehicles began to flash, washing the rain-slicked pavement in a blinding, chaotic strobe. The lead Black Hawk landed in the middle of the intersection with a precision that defied physics, its downdraft a hurricane of wind and water that inverted umbrellas and sent trash cans rolling down the street. Sarah stood frozen, clutching her box, as the side door of the helicopter slid open. Out stepped a man. He was tall, in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore the immaculate uniform of a 4-star general, the constellation of silver stars on his shoulders gleaming even in the dim light. He held a simple black cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it, a symbol of authority, not infirmity. He didn't run from the rain. He walked through it, as if the storm itself didn't dare touch him. He was General Tom Harrison, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the most powerful men in the world. He strode through the chaos, his eyes scanning the sidewalk. His gaze passed over the stunned pedestrians, the gawking bus driver. Then, his eyes found the small, shivering woman huddled under the bus shelter. His stern face broke into a small, weary smile. "You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the rotors. Behind him, a team of soldiers in tactical gear fanned out. One of them pointed directly at Sarah. "Target acquired," he said into his radio. A young soldier sprinted through the stalled traffic, dodging cars, his boots splashing through the deep puddles. He stopped in front of her, his face grim. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Lieutenant Colonel Miller, you need to come with us. Now." Sarah just stared, bewildered. "Lieutenant Colonel?" "Drop the box, ma'am. We're going," the soldier insisted, reaching for her arm. She clutched it tighter. "No, the box comes too." Back at the hospital, Harold Pemberton and Dr. Preston Sterling were in the middle of a hastily arranged press conference in the main lobby. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Sterling, looking somber and heroic, was spinning the story of a lifetime. "A deeply troubled and unstable employee," he was saying into the microphones, his voice filled with false sympathy. "She had a history of insubordination. In a moment of crisis, she unfortunately had a psychotic break and assaulted me, endangering a patient's life. Thankfully, I was able to intervene, stabilize the patient, and my team and I performed a life-saving surgery. The nurse in question has been terminated, and we are recommending a full psychological evaluation." It was a masterful lie, designed to paint him as the hero and Sarah as a dangerous lunatic. Pemberton stood beside him, nodding gravely, already seeing the positive press coverage that would save the hospital from a massive lawsuit. It was at that exact moment that the main entrance doors were thrown open. General Tom Harrison strode into the lobby, flanked by a wall of federal agents and military police. The rain dripped from his uniform onto the polished floor. The entire press corps fell silent, turning as one. Cameras swung around to capture the impossible image.
"I was watching your press conference on my way over," General Harrison said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute command.
"It's time to correct the record." Sterling's face went white. "General, this is a private hospital matter. You just told the nation that one of my best officers was fired for being unstable," the general interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You just took credit for a procedure you were too incompetent to even diagnose. This stopped being a hospital matter the moment you put your hands on Lieutenant Colonel Miller." He turned to one of his aides, who handed him a tablet. "I've reviewed the security footage from Trauma Bay 1. I've seen the telemetry data. A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax. You let a hero of the United States Navy nearly die because you were more concerned with a superficial neck wound." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Sterling. "And when a real doctor, a true hero, stepped in to save his life, you assaulted her." "That's a lie!" Sterling stammered, his bravado crumbling. "She attacked me!" "The footage shows her creating space to save a man's life while you were panicking," the general countered coldly. He turned to the stunned reporters. "Let me tell you who Sarah Miller really is." The aide handed him a black folder with the Department of Defense seal on it. The general opened it. He didn't need to read it. He knew it by heart. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller. 20 years in the Army Medical Corps, most of it attached to Joint Special Operations Command. 6 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. She was the lead trauma specialist for the 75th Ranger Regiment before being seconded to Delta Force. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 3 Purple Hearts. A collective gasp went through the lobby.
"They call her Dusty because she has personally pulled more soldiers out of the dust, alive,
than any other medic in the history of the program," the general continued, his voice ringing with pride. "Those shaky hands you mocked? That's nerve damage from holding a ranger's femoral artery closed with her bare hands for 6 hours under enemy fire. Her slow walk? That's from a shattered knee she got when a mortar hit her field hospital while she was shielding a wounded soldier with her own body. She saved my life in the Kunar province. She saved the life of the Secretary of Defense's son in Fallujah. The man she saved tonight, Navy SEAL Commander Nathan Wallace, is a national hero. And she saved him from you." Sterling was hyperventilating, his face the color of ash. "This is absurd. My father is Senator Sterling." "I spoke with your father on the helicopter," the general said dismissively. "He sends his apologies and his condolences for your career." He turned to the sweating, trembling Harold Pemberton. "As of this moment, this hospital's federal funding is under review. A team from the Department of Justice is on its way to investigate a decade of your billing practices, and what I'm told is a pattern of malpractice cover-ups. I suggest you start updating your resume." Pemberton looked like he was going to faint. He pulled a termination letter from his pocket, one clearly pre-written for just such an emergency, and shoved it at Sterling. "Dr. Sterling, effective immediately, your privileges are suspended. The board has voted to terminate your contract, pending a federal investigation." Sterling crumpled. The handsome, arrogant prince was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken boy. At that moment, the main doors opened again. The young soldier from the street entered, holding the door for Sarah Miller. She was still in her damp scrubs, still clutching her soggy cardboard box. She looked small and tired, but she no longer looked defeated. She walked with her head held high, her limp a badge of honor, her tremor a testament to her sacrifice. The entire lobby was silent. The soldiers, the MPs, the federal agents, they all turned to face her.
The young soldier who had escorted her in snapped to attention. "Present! Arms!" he barked. 12 rifles snapped up in a perfectly synchronized salute. They weren't saluting the general. They were saluting the quiet nurse with the cardboard box. Sarah stopped, her eyes filling with tears for the first time that night. General Harrison walked over to her and gently took the box from her hands. "We'll take this, Colonel," he said softly. He turned to Sterling, who was staring in abject horror. And then, the final, perfect moment of karmic justice. Big Mike Cogan stepped forward. In his hands, he held another empty cardboard box, the one Sarah had dropped hours ago. He walked right up to the disgraced doctor and held it out. "I believe you know the way out, Dr. Sterling," Big Mike said, his voice low and steady. "Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I'm sure you'll manage." Cameras flashed, capturing the image forever. The once powerful surgeon, his face streaked with tears, being handed a cardboard box by the security guard he had never bothered to learn the name of, while the nurse he tried to destroy stood surrounded by the full might and respect of the United States military. And that is the incredible true story of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now, getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.